Chinese SUVs have been quietly selling in Britain for over a decade now, and the used examples are currently among the most heavily discounted vehicles on the entire market, purely because of a badge perception that has almost nothing to do with how these things actually hold up mechanically. Let's get straight into it. The MG ZS, particularly the earlier petrol variants built after SAIC's acquisition of the MG name, gets dismissed constantly by buyers who remember MG as a struggling British badge, rather than understanding what it's actually become. Underneath that familiar badge is modern Chinese manufacturing with genuinely competitive build quality, and the naturally aspirated petrol engine fitted to early examples is straightforward, understressed, and has proven remarkably trouble-free in real-world ownership. Prices on these have collapsed, specifically because buyers can't decide whether they're looking at a British classic or a Chinese newcomer, and that confusion has worked entirely in favour of anyone willing to look past it. The interior quality on early examples surprised most reviewers when new, coming in noticeably ahead of what the price point suggested it should be. And that same gap between quality and reputation has followed the car onto the used market. Owners who've run these for several years consistently report fewer issues than the badge's confused identity would lead a cautious buyer to expect. The Great Wall Steed, sold as a pickup-based SUV variant in various configurations, suffers from almost total anonymity in the British market, despite genuinely tough underpinnings borrowed from proven commercial vehicle engineering. Farmers who bought these specifically for their low price and genuine off-road capability have generally reported minimal issues beyond basic servicing. And because Great Wall never built any meaningful brand recognition here, resale values sit dramatically below what the actual mechanical toughness deserves. Commercial buyers, farmers and small tradesmen specifically, tend to be considerably more pragmatic than private car buyers about badge reputation, caring far more about whether something starts every morning and hauls what it's supposed to haul than about what a neighbour might think of the name on the tailgate. That pragmatic buyer base has kept these in genuine daily working use for years, quietly accumulating real-world reliability data that the wider private market has simply never noticed. The Chery Tiggo, sold briefly in Britain before Chery's temporary withdrawal from the market, exists now in a strange, orphaned position where owners can't easily find dealer support, which has driven prices down to almost nothing, despite an engine and drivetrain that owners consistently describe as trouble-free. Parts availability is the genuine catch here, so anyone considering one needs to check local independent garage support before committing. But the vehicle itself was never the weak link in this particular story. I spoke with an owner who bought one specifically because the price seemed almost implausible for what appeared to be a well-equipped, reasonably modern SUV, and 3 years later the only genuine frustration has been sourcing a single interior trim clip after a minor mishap, not anything related to the engine, gearbox or any core mechanical component. The Landwind X7, controversial when new for its close visual resemblance to a much more expensive European SUV, has never escaped the reputation damage that comparison caused, despite the mechanical underpinnings having nothing to do with the vehicle it was accused of copying. Buyers avoid it almost entirely on principle now, which has pushed prices for genuinely usable examples down to levels that reflect controversy rather than any real mechanical shortcoming. That controversy played out heavily in motoring press coverage when the car launched, and press coverage tends to linger in second-hand searches and public memory far longer than genuine ownership data ever does. Anyone actually driving one day to day has generally found a straightforward, unremarkable SUV underneath all that noise, mechanically indistinguishable in reliability terms from plenty of far less controversial badges selling for considerably more. A quick pause here. If you're finding this kind of breakdown useful, the actual numbers rather than badge assumptions, do me a favour and hit subscribe before we carry on. It's a small thing, but it genuinely helps. The BAIC Huansu, rarely seen and rarely discussed, represents one of the more obscure entries on this list, imported in relatively small numbers and largely forgotten by a market that never built any familiarity with the badge in the first place. The handful of examples still circulating tend to sell for whatever a buyer will offer, since there's essentially no established resale market to reference, and owners who've kept one running report straightforward, low-drama ownership once initial skepticism is set aside. The DFSK Glory, sold at genuinely aggressive pricing when new specifically to establish a foothold in an unfamiliar market, has depreciated further still on the used side, to the point where examples occasionally appear for prices that barely register as a purchase at all. The engineering underneath borrows heavily from established, proven components licensed from more established manufacturers, which explains why the drivetrain reliability has generally exceeded what the unfamiliar badge would suggest to a cautious buyer. The Zotier T600, distinctive for styling that drew direct comparison to established European SUVs when new, carries the same visual controversy baggage as the Landwind, and the same resulting price collapse. Underneath the contested styling sits a conventional, unremarkable drivetrain that owners have generally found dependable, proving once again that the controversy that damages a car's reputation rarely has anything to do with what's actually happening mechanically. The Haval H6 SAIC adjacent, through various ownership arrangements and sold in growing numbers as Chinese manufacturers have expanded their British presence, benefits from considerably more recent engineering than several other entries on this list, and yet still trades for a fraction of equivalent Japanese or Korean SUV pricing, simply because the badge hasn't built trust yet. Early independent reviews and owner reports have been consistently more positive than the price would suggest, making this one of the more confident recommendations on this entire list for anyone willing to be an early adopter of the badge's reputation. Great Wall's parent company behind Haval has poured serious engineering investment into this specific model globally, treating it as something of a flagship for proving Chinese SUV engineering can genuinely compete on quality rather than just price, and that global strategic priority has translated into a noticeably more developed platform than several older, less carefully resourced entries on this list. The JACS3, compact and rarely discussed in British car culture, offers straightforward mechanical simplicity wrapped in styling that never quite found its audience here. Owners who've run these report minimal drama, and the price reflects total market indifference rather than any genuine mechanical concern, making it one of the purest examples on this list of a vehicle worth considerably more as transport than as a recognised asset. The 10th entry on this list isn't a single named model, but a broader category worth understanding regardless of which specific badge you eventually consider. Any Chinese manufactured SUV sold in Britain through a small limited volume importer during the early wave of Chinese vehicles entering the market roughly a decade ago. These vehicles carry essentially zero resale value, specifically because there's no ongoing dealer network, no brand loyalty, and often no easy route to genuine parts. And yet, the underlying vehicles were frequently built on licensed or shared platforms from more established manufacturers, meaning the mechanical substance is often considerably sounder than the total absence of resale value would suggest. Before buying anything in this final, broader category specifically, spend real time confirming that either a local independent specialist or an active online owner community still supports the exact model in question, since that support is what genuinely determines whether ownership stays cheap and simple or turns into a frustrating search for a single obscure part. There's a pattern worth understanding across every single one of these 10. Chinese manufacturers entering the British market over the past decade have generally had enormous incentive to overbuild rather than cut corners, because a single high-profile reliability failure would have been catastrophic for an entire industry still trying to earn basic consumer trust in an unfamiliar market. That pressure translated into genuinely conservative engineering decisions across most of these badges, mirroring almost exactly the same pattern that played out with Japanese and Korean manufacturers decades earlier, when they too were fighting for credibility against established Western competition. What actually determines whether one of these 10 is a genuinely smart purchase or a genuine headache isn't the badge. And it isn't really the styling controversy that's damaged several of them so severely. It's parts availability specifically, checked properly and locally before you commit to anything. A mechanically sound vehicle becomes a genuine problem the moment a simple component takes 6 weeks to source from overseas, regardless of how well the underlying engineering was originally executed. Every car on this list carries the exact same underlying story. A badge that hadn't yet earned trust in an unfamiliar market, priced accordingly low by buyers who let that unfamiliarity override any genuine assessment of the mechanical substance underneath. That gap between reputation and reality is exactly where the value on this entire list currently sits, waiting for buyers patient enough to check local specialist support and actual owner experience, rather than assume the worst based purely on where a badge originated. If a listing on one of these catches your eye, and the price feels almost too low to make sense, it's worth spending an evening checking independent owner forums and confirming parts availability before writing the whole thing off. The badges nobody trusts yet are very often the ones quietly earning that trust right now, years before the wider market catches up and the prices reflect it properly.